First thing, it's important to understand the world in which Hegel was growing up and where his motivation comes from. Germany at the time was nothing more than a collection of diverse, backward, separated princedoms in what was called the Holy Roman Empire. They were surrounded by powerful states like Austria, Russia, England and France, who basically marched backwards and forth across Germany, kicking them around and doing what they will with them. At the same time, Germany, of course, was an extremely cultured part of the world, but they were utterly denied any say in the affairs of Europe or any control over their own lives. So it was in that context that Hegel took an interest in the concepts of Volksgeist and Zeitgeist. Volksgeist, the spirit of a people, and the spirit of the time, Zeitgeist. He didn't invent these terms. The terms were made up by a Herder, but he wanted to investigate why one people could build a powerful state and change the course of history, while another people would basically live in slavery or be marginalised. And that one people would come to the fore at one stage in history and then fall into the background, while at another time another people would come to the fore. So these were Hegel's concerns. So although later on spirit became a unitary thing which kind of pre-existed history and manifested itself in history, we can understand Hegel better if we realise that this wasn't his starting point. It was what came out of an effort to kind of unify his reflections. He started with understanding the spirit of a time and the spirit of a particular people as different from another, and to inquire into the sources of why people in a certain time and place thought in a certain way, and people in another place, another time, thought in a different way. So he was a cultural, historical psychologist whose concerns began with culture and history, and later went to the only way in which culture and history can exist, and that's through individual human beings. And it's important to understand this as Hegel's starting point, because Hegel began with thinking and a material culture and a way of life as a single unitary thing, and this is what the spirit of a people and the spirit of a time is. Now, in terms of the history of philosophy, I want to introduce Hegel in terms of his contribution to our conception of the subject. The subject goes back to Aristotle, of course, and the subject is the Latin translation of the Greek word, and in ancient times it meant the same as it means in grammar. The subject was something of which a predicate could be said about. So if you strip away the name of something, its colour, where it is, and everything you could say about it, the subject's what's left. And this was a concept that lasted for many centuries, until Descartes gave it its particular spin. And along with all the heretics and opponents of sort of Christian domination at the time, Descartes introduced this kind of dualism. And this was, as we know, a subject-matter type of dualism. Now, Descartes' concept, of course, was very problematic, though it's one that expresses very well, I think, ordinary consciousness, even to this very day. But within philosophy, where it led to was in opposition to empiricism, not so much in opposition to it, but together with its opposite, empiricism, it led to a very destructive kind of skepticism. And ultimately to Hume. And it was Hume's skepticism which stimulated Kant to respond to this, because if Hume was right, then there could be no science. And Kant recoiled from this and introduced his critical philosophy. So the subject for Kant was transcendental. Let's say it was no real thing at all. It wasn't homunculus like it had been for the early empiricists. It was a nothing. It was simply an X about which something could be said, such as that it thought. So there was no inner person or inner subject. There was just a transcendental subject. The effect of this was to remove the subject from itself, from all history and culture. It stood aside from them because it was a nothing. At the same time, it had direct access to pure reason, from which it could deduce the proper laws of conduct and the nature of time and space, thereby being able to engage with experience. Now, this was unsatisfactory because it placed the subject outside of history and referred the conduct of life to eternal, universal laws standing outside history. Now, it was Johann Fichte who tackled this problem in Kant. And Kant defined the ego as pure activity. And in my reading of the history, it says with Fichte that pure activity first enters philosophy as a conception for psychology. And Hegel, in fact, retained this definition of the self as pure activity. Now, what Fichte did is he made a pragmatic critique of Kant. That is to say, he sought to derive natural law from the interactions between individuals. And it's still this kind of pragmatic critique that I would advocate is the way that Hegel has to be modernised. Now, Hegel retained this conception, but he did the difficult thing that's to do for the pragmatic critique, is he had to turn it around, because according to Hegel, Fichte was trying to deduce the state or the nature of the whole community from the individual. And Hegel's very reasonable claim was this was self-evidently not the case, that one had to deduce the psyche and nature of the individual from the state. So he had to turn this pragmatic critique, which would derive everything from activity and interactions amongst people, to the foundation to derive the nature of the human condition. Now, I want to move to one of Hegel's early works, The System of Ethical Life, which dates from 1803 to 1804, prior to the Phenomenology, where in relatively clear terms, relatively to Hegel's normal, totally arcane and impenetrable style, he explains the foundations of his psychology. What he says is that when needs are immediately satisfied through existence in nature, there's no consciousness. But what happens with the development of human society is that a gap opens up between needs and their satisfaction. And this delayed gratification is mediated by a labour process which divides activity into consumption and production. And he claims, with great insight, I think, that this separation between needs and their satisfaction is the foundation of human consciousness. It also brings with it, of course, a division of labour, the division between theory and practice, and ultimately a surplus product, that human life produces something over and above what it needs to live, and this creates the capacity for subjects to interact with one another. The structure of this early work is also very profound. The whole book consists of an alternation between intuition being subsumed under the concept and the concept being subsumed under intuition. Intuition and concept are ideas that come from Kant as the two fundamental sources of knowledge. And one of the problems with Kant was, how do you reconcile these two apparently quite distinct sources of knowledge, one through sensuous perception of the world, the other through reason. Now, Hegel's idea is that you live in a world and you, through sensuous contact and work in that world, you learn of it, right? But this world isn't just nature. It's things made by people. It includes institutions, buildings, words, tools, and so on. And these are concepts. They're concepts that exist in the world. So that when we, for instance, use a tool, we sensuously and intuitively grasp a concept, which is a norm of labour. And conversely, when we do something, we are acting according to, under the guise of reason, working in the world sensuously, making and doing and consuming things, and we have their intuition consumed under the concept. So he sees the whole history as this fact that the world is not as it ought to be. There's always a gap or a conflict between intuition and concept, and this continual subsumption of one under the other is a driver for history, if you like. So long as the world that we sensuously know and live in differs or in conflict with the world that we know through reason ought to be, then there must be change and inner conflict. And it's wonderful the way he describes this contradiction which clearly exists in the very heart of thought or consciousness and locates it in the world of human affairs. In other words, he creates here a concept of mind which genuinely contains the contradiction which Kant was wrestling with. Now, in this same work, The System of Ethical Life, Hegel identifies three different categories of activity which are constructing the universal, are building up consciousness and the human form of life. Firstly, there's working with means of production, and he goes through what one learns in working with plants, and how one grows and develops as a human through working with animals, and how in turn working with machines develops consciousness and, of course, the world in which you live. And through this, if we categorize all them briefly as tools, that's one, the tool is then one paradigmatic artifact through which the universal is constructed. The second is paradigmatically the word, or the entirety of symbolic structure, and that's the second paradigmatic kind of artifact that we use in order to construct the universal. And Hegel has a third, which is the child, raising the next generation, that is to say, taking our knowledge and actually becoming aware of it and conscious of it in the sense that we have to give it to the next generation. So succession planning he puts on the same level as working with tools and working with words. So three ways in which spirit or mind is constructed. And I think this is something that's well worth our paying attention to. So that's how consciousness is constructed. This is, if you like, an elementary level of consciousness, of being aware of the difference between a subject and an object. The next level is self-consciousness, when one lives in a world where one is aware that there are other subjects. The next major point is the Phenomenology of Spirit, his most famous work, and I can only be really very brief here. But in the Phenomenology of Spirit, the most important thing we have to understand is the subject matter of this book. What is it about? Well, it's about formations of consciousness, or Gestalt. And a Gestalt is three things together. It's consciousness in the ordinary, everyday sense of a person's thinking. It's also consciousness in the form of civilizations, the entirety of the objective thought, if you like, objective mind, though he didn't call it objective mind at that time. That's something that came up later. And it's they're putting two things together. That is to say, activity and material culture. He tells the story of the development of mind three times. Firstly, through the development of thought, and this isn't Ontology talks about the development of thinking from the beginning of civilization up to the present time as in terms of thought. Then he retells it in terms of if you like, history, the development of different social formations in which these forms of thought existed. And then the third part is told as spirit knowing itself. That is to say, when this story is told by the thinker and the form of thought, the form of society that knows and understands itself as a part of that whole history. And one of I think the key concept to be taken out of the phenomenology of spirit is this concept of immanent critique. When you're reading this book, you'll read something and go, oh, that's a load of rubbish or whatever, and then sort of 10 pages later you find Hegel showing that it's a load of rubbish and then saying something else. That he doesn't stand aside from his subject matter, that is to say a particular form of consciousness, and say what's wrong with it. He enters into that subject matter, the formation of consciousness, and argues in its own terms. So the idea is to show how in any way of thinking or formation of consciousness, there is a certain standard of truth, a certain form of inference by which what is true is measured. And by continual application of that, at a certain point, the continual questioning of things, of putting things to the test, this continual skepticism leads to a negation of that, and it finds itself to be untrue. And at some point or other then, truth which is able to overcome that particular form of skepticism arises. And the second thing I'd like to draw attention to through once one has self-consciousness, that is to say, society isn't just one integral subject, but one has differences and conflicts contained within society, you have this problem of the relation between the individual and society, which is not problematic in the beginning. In ancient society, the individual was simply a member of their particular tribe or city-state or whatever. But once you go on the road to modernity, you have this problem of how the individual sees itself in relation to the whole society or the universal. And Hegel just briefly sketches through a succession of stages in this book how this contradiction is worked out. And he sees it being worked out in changes in the form of consciousness stretching over a couple of thousand years. Okay? I want to move briefly now to the logic, which for me is the richest of all Hegel's works, and in a way the easiest to understand because it's just logic. Hegel himself makes it clear that it's impossible to understand the logic without life experience and some knowledge of history and so on, but at the same time it's just logic, and anyone who has life experience can understand that. The problem is to understand what the hell is the subject matter of the logic. What is it that he's talking about when he brings forward these different propositions? The phenomenology was about formations of consciousness, and these change. They change in real time, and they're empirically visible things. If you understand how a particular society works, you can see it, you can enter into it, understand its logic, then it has dynamic, it changes. And what the logic is about is the logic which underlies the truth or eventual falsification internally of forms of consciousness. Right? So whereas formal logic just talks about things and their attributes, Hegel's logic is talking about formations of consciousness. The logic has three phases, or three books. In the first book is the doctrine of being, and here the opposites simply come one damn thing after another. Right? One thing comes forward and it fails, it passes away and is replaced by another. The former opposite is gone. Once you have realised that being amounts to nothing, there's no going back. Right? You can only go forward to becoming. The second phase is essence. And here, when a proposition is put forward and it meets a counter-proposition, then these two opposites remain as each other's opposites. You have form and content, and the opposition, form and content remain there. But what happens is the particular opposition between form and content is supplanted by another opposition, but form and content remain there. So through essence, you have a continual build-up and concretization of an idea, until eventually, when you move to the doctrine of the notion, that entire genesis is negated with the formation of a brand new notion, which captures the problem that essence is dealing with, and unites it with the being of the thing. And here, as every new opposition or challenge comes along, it's incorporated into the notion, making it more concrete. And in fact, that's the whole process of life. Now, I find, although this is very abstract, it doesn't talk about real people, real times, or anything, it's extremely rich because it talks about what is necessary in the development and change of thinking. Now, my favourite part of the logic is the what's called the subject. This is the first part of the notion. And it's quite difficult to grasp, but all the time when Hegel's talking about subject, he's not using this word in the Kantian sense. It's basically a synonym for an individual. Not at all. Hegel is neither a liberal nor a structuralist. He has a quite unique conception of the understanding between the individual and the universal, or the individual and the collective, if you like. He sees the subject as being simultaneously three things: individual, universal, and particular. And in the logic, these are terms to be understood logically. So the individual is a specific proposition. You can also understand it as a specific idea existing, if you like, in the head of an individual at a particular moment. The universal is the idea itself. Yeah? So whereas the individual is finite and mortal, it lives and dies, the universal is this eternal concept, if you like. And the particular, it mediates between these. So it doesn't live forever, it's ongoing, it continues so long as a particular form of life where individuals operate according to this universal exists. So for example, if you want to know about unionism, trade unionism, my favourite topic, unions cannot exist other than there being individual members of unions. It cannot exist without people actually belonging to unions, not just having a general sentiment in favour of unions. You have to have unions, right? And none of these can exist without the conception and understanding, when people belong to these bodies, that these are unions, and all the beliefs and ideas and principles that go along with them. Because if they're not unions but insurance societies, then of course you don't have unionism. And the individual and the universal in particular here all mediate between each other. And basically Hegel's idea is that the subject, which begins simply as an abstract thing, like down with sexism, in the course of time, through the construction of actual forms of practice, and the changing of the universal principles through ever concretizing them through the experiences of the millions of individuals that engage in those practices, ultimately that's how you get a mature, real idea. Now, I hope that wasn't too arcane. Trying to deliver Hegel's concept of the subject in 3 minutes is very challenging. Although Hegel presents the individual universal in particular here as a logical triad, as I see it in our times, and if you look at how Hegel actually uses this in his social theory and political theory and his ethics and so on, it really can only be understood for an implied ontology. That's to say, different kinds of things existing. So the way I read the doctrine of the subject is when he's talking about individual, he's talking about the psyche, the thing that's tied to an individual body and it lives and dies. When he talks about the universal, I take this to be material culture. I say material so that other people outside of cultural historical activity theory understand what we're talking about and don't mix it up with a form of activity. So we're talking about material culture, which on the one hand, of course, exists as things such as tools or words written in a page, but on the other hand also exists in our internalization of them, in the changes to our own body in which these same material things are embodied. So our bodies are included there in material culture. And activity, the third thing, which is what I understand by particular. Ongoing things in which people get to know about things. And you'll see this ontology can be justified if you read, for example, Hegel's social theory, how he attempts to construct his theory of the state in terms of forms of mediation, whereby people can have freedom, not just as individuals, but through an actual control of their existence in the world by being able to engage with and express themselves through the power of the entire community. So let's just sum up. Now, Hegel is very antique. One has to get our heads around the fact, of course, that this great historical thinker didn't know Darwin, and not only did he not know about Darwin's theory of evolution, he actually actively rejected Lamarck's theory of evolution. He thought that the world was created by God, if you like, and life entered matter with a flash of lightning. He knew what he didn't know. That's how he believed these things. He had no substitute for these ideas. What he was interested in was the development of mind. And he had no theory, for example, of how the human body developed. He actively rejected the human body developed out of the animal. But, for example, he believed that women were weaker than men, not only physically but intellectually, and because he didn't have a theory of the development of the human body. So it's extremely limited in that sense. Also, he never knew social movement. He always believed that the only hope for the development of civilization was if the educated and powerful, wealthy classes in society should do something about things. He had no conception that the rabble, as he called them, could actually get organised and change the course of history. He certainly had no conception of a women's movement. He knew some very, very powerful women around him in his milieu, but he wouldn't even talk to these women about his philosophy because he held that they weren't able to understand it. So there are enormous limitations in Hegel. Now, the question of what Marx did with Hegel, of course, is a huge subject. His additional emphasis on production is an important contribution, and of course his work about value and how the formation of how abstraction is a process that takes place in human activity objectively, not just as a mental process. This is a clearly Hegelian theme, but as far as I can see, it's Marx's unique contribution. Also, the concept of alienation, again, clearly a Hegelian theme, but one which Hegel himself was never able to grasp. He didn't see any real distinction between wage labour and labour within an organisation with which the individual identified. Okay. So finally, I think one of the major challenges still facing social psychology today is the individual-society dichotomy. I think Hegel has some fantastic things to contribute to this problem, and a very good way to begin to tackle them, together with a variety of currents of social psychology, would be to see if we can appropriate from Hegel what he has to contribute to social psychology today. Thank you.